Okay, well today we are going to talk through the Life in the Balance series, and we're going to dive into the topic of boundaries. And boundaries, when you initially think of the word or say the word, people kind of have a twist in the gut, and we don't really want to discuss it because we assume a lot of times they're just limitations. And so we tend to run from boundaries. There's kind of this apprehension when we hear it, and we think that, it's going to somehow negatively impact us. But in trying to strive, like through the series we've talked about, trying to strive to find a balance of what we value, who we are, in contrast to what society, what work culture may emphasize as well too, and how to not lose that. And boundaries are one of the key elements to help us navigate this. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So why do we need boundaries? One of the first things we need to do is respect how we are made. I have always had this dream since I was a kid that I want to fly. I would have these. It was this reoccurring dream for a while, and so any psychologists here that want to analyze this, let me know. But I would have, and it was the 80s and 90s, so I had this windbreaker on. But I would unzip the windbreaker, and then the wind would gust, and then all of a sudden I would just take off, and I could fly around. And it was like this reoccurring dream I constantly had. But I've always wanted to fly. But realistically, I'm not made that way. And although that analogy, that example seems kind of silly in the physical sense, we find ourselves basically trying to fly emotionally, mentally sometimes when we're not wired that way. So we keep trying to take on impossible tasks and do these things even though we're not wired that way. So physically we'd be like, oh, that's silly, you can't fly. Mentally that's like, oh yeah, we can try to do this. So we don't really respect limitations that we have in that. We need to acknowledge how we're made, and boundaries acknowledge how you're made. With that is our limitations. Every person will be different, and I think one of the things that tends to happen when you think about boundaries, people try to carbon copy boundaries, but one of the realities is that everyone has different capacities, capabilities, talents, and resources. So therefore, boundaries will differ by person. And so in the acknowledge of that, I need to acknowledge where I'm at. What my roles are, what has gone on in my life, where I'm at currently. And I need to draw, appropriate boundaries in that, and acknowledging those limitations. What helps do that is boundaries help define roles and responsibilities. So what happens a lot of times when people try to cross boundaries is they try to make you responsible for something that you were not previously responsible for. So relationally, someone tries to make you responsible for their emotional well-being, although that is not your role in that. And so we need to look and see at these different situations and how we draw boundaries. These boundaries help us define basically what is us and what is them. And not in a mean way, but in a healthy, functioning way. And so we need to take a look at where we draw the lines in that. And we also need to debunk the myth that boundaries are bad. When done in a healthy way, boundaries can actually be one of the most freeing things that we can do for ourselves, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, is living within the limits also frees us up to fully function in a healthy way, in the way that God has created us to be. So, boundaries. Everybody's different. We already talked about that. You may see someone that you kind of idolize, or that is a mentor, hero for you. However, your boundaries are going to be different than theirs because you're a different person. There may be similarities between them, but we need to keep in mind that those are going to vary and differ. Boundaries are also determined by both our capacity, but then also by our value. And this is really where faith comes in, by what we value, what God calls us to, our spiritual lives. That will impact our boundaries and where we place those things. We will do this. We will not do this. This is against my faith. This is against what God is calling me to do personally, and what I believe. And so all of those factors help determine where you draw a boundary line. It's also interesting to see that boundaries will solidify as you age. Kind of in adolescence, your parents set your boundaries, and you function within those. When you go to college, and shortly after, your boundaries start to solidify, and you start to see, sometimes people throw the boundaries out the door and try to live all out, and then a little bit later, like, oh shoot, what did I do? And try to redraw some more there quickly. But as you get older, these boundary lines will solidify, because you also learn more of what you value, who you really are, what your capacities are, how you're gifted. And as you increase in your awareness, we'll talk about that a little bit later too, but as you increase in your awareness, your boundary line will solidify. And you will be able to say, what we'll also talk about is a healthy no. Like, no, that is not me. Like, that's a line right there. And your ability to do that will increase as you age. One of the things that's interesting is a lot in corporate America and our work culture, and you see a lot of companies really striving to do this in some ways, but the danger is when we try to outsource the enforcement of our boundaries to the companies, corporations, organizations that we work for. And there was a TED Talk in 2010 that talked about that. I can't remember the guy's name right off my head, but he was talking about how we're projecting the responsibility, we're advocating the responsibility for our boundaries to the corporation, yet we neglect to realize that it's not the corporation's job for me to be healthy. The corporation's job is to do this business and make money. And so it's interesting, you see a company like Google, which has massive resources, and so they create these things so people can work anytime. There's like slides in their corporate office, and like actually beds there too, gyms. We have a couple friends that work for Google. And they kind of make it this utopia environment somewhat, focusing on like, oh, we want you to be healthy. But what they're also doing is you're creating an environment where people will never leave work. Like, they never have to leave work. So that's also not healthy. So even companies, you're like, oh, they're doing it well. They're creating this mental health utopia for people. It's like, actually, they're not, because they are making work world your only world in that functioning. And so we have to realize this is going to be our own personal responsibility. We can, and you can kind of give a correlating leadership talk in all of this too. You can help create environments that help your employees, your coworkers, have healthy boundaries and respect those. So you can help foster that environment. However, it's not your responsibility to enforce those boundaries, so to speak. You can give people heads up. We're entering our crazy season. Boundaries are about to get tested, and I see that, I know that. So we can influence it by how we communicate, but it's ultimately up to us. But the reality is, some things will always be at odds. We won't hit this utopia state where nobody is trying to cross your boundary, or circumstances won't try to push on your boundary. And so I think a lot of times we're like, oh, we'll work hard, we'll push through, it'll get better. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. But the issue is in this pushing through, it doesn't get better. It's just the nature of this type of work, or the nature of this position, is that this is the intensity level. It will always be at odds. with the boundary lines that you're trying to draw. And so we need to acknowledge that and make decisions based according to them. So how do you create, a healthy, functioning boundary? Because you can draw a lot of lines, but if you don't enforce them and if they're not practical, like it's not going to work. And so we need to walk through how do we create these boundaries. One of the key is not just awareness, but I would say mature awareness. You can be aware of something and not really change anything. A mature awareness is whenever you see what is going on and your decision making is therefore influenced by the information that you have recognized and seen and taken in. So a mature awareness is key when we draw these boundaries. And one of the key things, God has created us to live in the context of community. And really, a lot of times in boundaries, what is most affected are relationships. So I'm going to camp out on this one for a while, but I want to focus on 3 main areas of relationships. And a lot of this is taken by a counselor from Sage Hill Resources named Chip Dodd. Fascinating thing, but he talks about how you can actually have a relationship in 3 kind of areas. The first is your relationship with God. So in drawing this boundary line, we process through my relationship with God as a believer in Christ is the epicenter of my identity. So how is what I am walking into or what I am challenged to accept, how will that impact my relationship with God? And what boundary lines need to be drawn. And we'll walk through an example, a biblical example here in a minute, looking at that a little bit more. But how will our environments affect our relationship with God? What boundary lines do we need to draw to protect this? If it is the core of our identity, it is worth protecting. However, so often we just kind of live off the cuff. We're more reactive to things instead of being proactive with things. But if it is who we are, it is worth protecting. And we have to protect it. Second, you can actually, Chip Dodd, when he goes through this, he talks about loneliness. You can be lonely from God. You can also be lonely from yourself. So your relationship with yourself. There has to be, in drawing a boundary line, there has to be this awareness of how God has made you, who He has called you to be, what He has empowered you to do. And because if you are not aware of that, what begins to happen is you begin to turn from God to other people to define you, and you tell me what I'm good at. You tell me what I should do. And it becomes this disconnected living where I'm actually living based on what you think I should do, what society thinks I should do, what this value. So your value system switches. So there has to be this awareness of what specifically has God called you to do. One of the things I heard a long time ago is God's heart for the world is huge. So big in that one person cannot contain it. So therefore, His heart is divided up and placed in all of us. And it is the process of you learning what piece of God's heart do you have. And then how do you steward that piece? Your piece will be different from your piece. Your calls will be different. What happens a lot of times, people may be so passionate about their call, they kind of steamroll people into their project when it's like, that's actually not me. And that's not what God has called me to. Which can get messy on the ministry side of things because it's just like, well, do you not love Jesus? Do you not love people? It's like, me loving people isn't the issue. The factor is God has called me to this. And there can be a healthy no in ministry. That needs to happen more. So there has to be this understanding of your relationship with yourself, how God has crafted you, who you are to be. And then also our relationship with others. God has called us to live in the context of community. How will this environment, this work environment, this situation we're going into, how will that affect my relationship with others? And how do I steward that? So your family relationships, wife, spouse, children, family, friends, like what is this doing? What is this role going to do with your relationships? How do you steward that well? How do you invest? How do you function in the midst of that? And this is one of the things that is kind of really difficult about this one. And I would say this is kind of a principal line, is if you're drawing a boundary line that involves other people, you need to talk with them. So you should not, it is not healthy to draw boundary lines for relationships without talking to the other person involved in that relationship. That helps manage expectations. It helps navigate certain trick things. It helps stewardship, accountability. It helps all of those. And so we need to talk through these instead of isolating and try to do it all ourselves. So a lot of times drawing boundaries aren't our issue. Enforcing boundaries, that's the issue. We can all be like, oh yeah, I definitely need a boundary line there, like this is crossed. The issue is living it out. And so what does that look like? So I wanted to really quick talk through this. And a lot of it is coming from Scripture. So discipline is one of the main things that you see in the enforcement of boundaries. So much so that when God created the world, He put in there, in our week, He put a Sabbath day. I think the Sabbath is there, and the Sabbath is fascinating, but I think it's there for several key reasons. One is to practice discipline. Sabbath makes you aware. It is a weekly pause where you stop and you acknowledge you have limits. You acknowledge that you need to stop. You also, and an article Tim Keller wrote about Sabbath, he goes, you observe the Sabbath to remind you that you are not God and He doesn't need you. And so many times we make ourselves so important that we can't stop working. And what happens is we begin to put our significance in place of God's sovereignty. Does God use us? Yes. Does He need you? Not really. So we're involved with His work. It is a blessing. He brings us in. He makes us a part of His story and what He is doing. However, we have limits. And He wants us to live in those limits. And so I think the Sabbath in God's divine creation is a consistent reminder of our limitations because those limitations reveal our need for Him. So if you're trying to live limitless, you're trying to be a demigod. You're trying to be almighty, and you're not. And so we have to walk through that. I also heard spiritual discipline described as practicing to do naturally what does not come naturally now. So in these roles of boundaries, a lot of times we don't want to draw a boundary, or we do, but it's a hard time enforcing it. But it's going to take discipline to enforce this boundary. You know, I heard it said too, it takes 13 times doing something for it to become a habit. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what it says. So it's going to take the continual practice of applying this boundary line, and then it will become a more natural boundary line. Another reminder, kind of lump those two together, but the call to Sabbath, just this weekly reminder of limits. What are we doing? This is also, I think, another spiritual discipline that helps you draw boundary lines is fasting. Fasting would be another spiritual discipline to apply and to practice. And I think, too, it's kind of like if you practice in some and getting it, you may see that fruit also come about in other areas of your life, being able to tell yourself no to other things. And with spiritual discipline as well, the heart connection here of spiritual discipline isn't self-promotion. It isn't self-righteousness, but it is our connection with God. And so the heart is going to be the main check here in these things. So another huge part of enforcing boundaries is faith. It is going to take faith because there will be conflict. And for certain people, if you study the Enneagram, for some people, conflict isn't an issue, and for other people, they avoid it like the plague. And it will require faith. The ability to have a healthy no. So I know what God has called me to. I know how He has gifted me. I know where it's at. And I am fine saying no to this situation. Because I also realize I can do that well. I can tell you no well. But I'm also not responsible for your emotional well-being in telling you no. And that's between you and God, not me. I can do that in a respectful way. And that we'll talk about that as well in the area of communication here in a couple weeks. But I need to have a healthy no, the ability to tell somebody no. And it will always require sacrifice. Drawing a boundary requires sacrifice. Will you lose something at work? Maybe. And that's the thing, is like living with FOMO, the fear of missing out. When you draw a boundary line, you're going to have it. You know, it's like, oh, hey, we're all staying late for work to do this. Do you want to come? It's like, no, I drew this boundary line that I would always eat dinner with my family. And so I'm not going to. And so it's the process of going through, I'm letting these things go because I'm trusting God for something better. And so that is going to take faith. A lot of times the reason why we cross our boundaries is because what is being offered is very tangible. You can make more money. You can do this. You know, you can do blah, blah, blah. So it's basically, are we wanting to exchange what we are hoping for, what we are longing for, what God promises? Are we exchanging that for what we can have right now? And that is always going to require faith. And we can learn from the saints. And so Daniel is a great example of this. From the beginning, in Daniel chapter 1, he walks through it. So Israel's been taken into captivity. Daniel is living in Babylon. This is when they first come in. I'm going to skip some of these because of the names. Although I think there aren't enough people named Ashpenaz. That's a pretty cool name. You can call him Naz for short. Anyway. But, Ashpenaz is actually the one that's in charge and over Daniel and working with him. So Daniel and this group of guys come in, these Israelites, and they come into the palace. And then the king basically assigns to them what food they will eat or drink. They'd be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they will stand before the king. So they list their names. They change their names. So Daniel was actually called Belteshazzar, and it walks through the others. But then Daniel draws a boundary line. And I think that's important here. Daniel wasn't staging a protest. There were different attitudes from the Israelites. You can see this in Scripture in 3 different places. But there are different attitudes of the Israelites being in Babylon. One is there's kind of this God has abandoned us, this despair model. You can read about in Psalms. Then there's another where it's like, oh, we're in captivity. We'll only be here for 2 years, and then God's going to take us out. But then there's other, you can see this in the prophet Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, no, we're going to be in captivity for a while. And this is what God is calling us to do. And that's where it says, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. So everybody always stitches. It's like, you do realize that was written while people were in captivity. It's like, it's like there's a context for that verse in that. But so that's kind of what's going on. So Daniel goes along with things. Like he's like, okay, I'll go to your school for 3 years. I'll learn your language. I'll now go by Belteshazzar, although that's a lot harder to spell than Daniel. You know, it's like he goes by all these things. He's willing to go, but then he draws this boundary line with food, which is a bit bizarre. It's not like it was bad food, because it says it was the king's food. And some people were like, oh, well, it could be dietary things, but it's a Middle Eastern culture. There was probably a lot of similarities, so that's not fully it either. And some of me wonders, did Daniel have the awareness of where his lines were? Like, I can go along with this and be fine, but if I start going down this road, this is a slippery slope. Because I will actually enjoy the food too much. It's not that he didn't like the food. It may be because he actually loved the food. And so was this food a gateway for him to compromise? I can function in some of this okay, like I can navigate this, okay, that's all right. But then it comes this other thing. It's like, I know this is a struggle for me. And if I don't draw this boundary line, it's going to be like a domino of compromise. So he draws this line. He communicates it well. When he talks to this guy, he's not like, we ain't eating your food and like all rude about it. But he's actually, he said, he refers to himself as servants, servants to the king. He's being very respectful in how he presents it and what he does. And a lot of times, as Christians, I mean, we've lived in kind of this, even struggle to say like Christian culture, but Christian influence culture for so long that a lot of times too we think we're oppressed when people don't respect certain boundaries. But the reality is things have shifted. Daniel could have said, like, I came from Israel, this is how I'm going to be treated. Instead, he was very respectful and explained kind of why, and then also gave a counter and put himself at risk. So he created this scenario in such a way that Ashpenaz would not be held accountable if Daniel fell short. So it showed he was actually watching out for Ashpenaz. And so in drawing a boundary line, it's being aware, how is it affecting different people? How can I steward this well, where God has put me, and how can we walk through this? So he draws the line, and then many of you know the story. It goes all the way through, and they actually excel in what the test was, and go on to become influencers in the culture. So, in learning from Daniel and enforcing these boundary lines, knowing yourself, like what is the thing here? Like, what's the domino that it's like if this one falls, and if I cross this boundary line, the others are going to start to fall. And are you aware of what that is for you? We all got one. With Daniel's, it could have been food. I think it's funny because automatically people are like, boundaries. Are there any exceptions? I was like, by nature, the definition of an exception is something that like hardly ever occurs. And so the application of boundaries should be a daily thing. So if you're automatically looking for exceptions, we need to do a bit of a heart check. Like, why am I wanting to get away with it before I'm even enforcing it yet? You know, it's like, what's going on there? So first off, let's check our heart. Second, the answer is yes. Sometimes there can be. And God will call us to step out. But I think there's a couple key metrics to look at as we look to see, like, is this worth crossing my boundary? The first one is this a phase or a pattern? A phase is a short frame of time. So, hey, we want you to do this. This will be for this window of time. A pattern is whenever that keeps reoccurring in a cyclical thing, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, that was that one thing for that limited time, and then here's another 2-week thing, and then here's another 2 and that becomes a pattern. That's not okay. And so looking through, are we being asked to compromise based on a pattern? And this can be a relational pattern, maybe. There are some hardships that hit once and you walk people through it, and then there's a cyclical hardship, and I need to actually draw a stronger boundary line too, because I don't want to enable bad behavior or enable something. That's when patterns come into play. And so, am I dealing with a phase, or is this a pattern? Is this a one-time thing, or is this a recurring thing? Another simple question is it eternal? So what you are being asked to give, does it have an eternal impact? Is God calling you to trust Him in this? Or is it more temporal? Like, no, I just want to cross this boundary line because I can make $5,000. I won't see my family for a month, but I'll have $5,000. It's like, okay, but should you do it? You know? Like, where are your boundary lines there? Like, that's not an eternal thing. So what's it look like here? How does this affect our relationships and community? So if you're being asked to make an exception, this is going back to our previous statement, is if this exception is going to impact others, they need to be brought into the conversation. You don't make a decision to go away for 3 weeks without talking to the people that you're leaving behind. But yet so many times we try to do that. And then ask people to get on board after we already made the decision. And that's not healthy. So, a couple questions to process in just a second. The next 2 weeks we'll cover margin next week. Steve will talk more about that. And then we'll also talk about communication. And then some reflection questions. What are some of the areas where you sense the need for boundaries? Do you have any examples of someone who has healthy boundaries? Somebody that has gone before, somebody like Daniel. What are some of the biggest barriers to drawing boundaries? And how have you seen someone communicate a boundary well? So like I said, we'll be diving deeper into margin, which is kind of the result of boundaries, and taking a step further with that. As well, these resources will be available on the app, and so you can go and watch the videos. Big thanks to Sam for helping us put those all online. And we'll see you next week. Thanks.